She handed it to me on a Thursday evening in October, right after dinner, when the plates were still on the table and I hadn't even had my coffee yet. A folder, not a single sheet, a folder with a clear plastic cover, the kind you buy at an office supply store when you want something to look official before anyone has read a word of it. She set it down next to my coffee cup and pushed it toward me with two fingers, the way you slide something across a table when you don't want your hand near it a moment longer than necessary. She said, "Dad, Curtis and I put together some things we think would help the house run better. Nothing personal, just structure." I opened the folder. 6 pages, typed, spaced, with little bullet points and a bolded header at the top of the first page that said Household Expectations Revised. I read every line. Quiet hours after 9, a chore rotation with my name on it in 3 places. A grocery contribution figure, specific to the dollar. A line about visitors needing 48 hours notice, and my name included in that line, not excluded from it, which is the detail that told me everything I needed to know about how she saw the 4 of us living under one roof. I closed the folder. I set my hand flat on top of it. I looked at my son's wife across the table I built with my own hands in 1991, and I said, "Before you say anything else, I need you to walk down to the end of the driveway and check the mailbox." She blinked at me. She said, "It's after 6, Dad. The mail already ran." I said, "Check it anyway." She looked at Curtis, who was suddenly very interested in his water glass, and then she got up and went. I heard the storm door. I heard her footsteps on the gravel. I sat there with my coffee going cold, and I did not open the folder again, because I already knew what was in it, and I already knew what was waiting for her outside. And those two things were about to meet each other for the first time. My name is Harold Whitfield. I am 67 years old. I live in a house outside Council Bluffs, Iowa, on 11 acres. My father cleared with a mule team in 1958, and what my daughter-in-law did not know when she slid that folder across my kitchen table was that I had been to see a lawyer 3 weeks earlier, and that the letter sitting in my mailbox that Thursday evening had left a Cedar Rapids law office 11 days before, and had been delivered by the Postal Service that very morning while she and Curtis were both at work. She had handed me her expectations. I had already sent my answer down the driveway to wait for her. She came back in holding it, and she was not the same woman who had walked out. I want to back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning starts 40 years before that Thursday. I spent 39 years working heavy equipment, and later running my own outfit, Whitfield Excavating, out of a pole barn on this same property, moving earth for farmers and county road crews, and eventually for 2 rural subdivisions that didn't exist before I dug the water lines for them. There is a particular kind of patience that comes from operating machinery that can kill you in half a second if you stop paying attention to it. You learn to read the ground before you touch it. You learn that the thing under the surface is never quite what the survey says it is, and that the survey is a starting guess, not a fact, and that the only way to know what's really down there is to go slow and watch closely and let the dirt tell you what it's going to tell you in its own time. I built that business from one used backhoe I financed through the Farmers State Bank in 1979 to a yard with 6 pieces of equipment and 11 employees at the peak of it, and I sold it in 2019 to my foreman, Dale Petracek, who had earned every bit of it over 16 years of showing up before I did and staying later than I did. I was 60 years old when I signed those papers, and I walked out of that pole barn for the last time with the settled feeling of a man who had finished a piece of work the right way. The way you backfill a trench so it doesn't settle wrong 5 years later and crack somebody's driveway. The house was the thing that never got a finish date. Because a house isn't a trench. It's the place where the people you love keep changing what they need from it. My wife Donna and I had been working on this house for 31 years by the time I sold the business, and Donna had opinions about every square foot of it, and she was right about nearly all of them, which used to irritate me in the early years, and which I came to depend on completely in the later ones. Donna K. Whitfield, born Donna K. Prosser in Logan, Iowa in 1957, was my wife for 38 years, and she had a gift I never had, which was the ability to see a person clearly the first time she met them, before they'd said enough to give themselves away to somebody slower like me. She taught 4th grade at Lewis Central for 26 years, and she used to say that 9-year-olds show you exactly who they are within the first week of school if you're paying attention, and that most adults never stop being 9 years old underneath. They just get better at the performance. She kept a garden journal she'd started in 1988, green cover, spiral bound, replaced every few years when she filled one up, and by the time she died I found 9 of them stacked in the hall closet in order, each one labeled by year in her handwriting, which slanted hard to the right and got a little shakier toward the end. In the last journal, the one from 2019, the year before her diagnosis, there were entries that weren't about tomatoes or the peony bed. There were 4 separate entries about our son Curtis and his wife Marlene, dated across the spring and summer, and none of them shared with me at the time, because Donna was still watching and hadn't decided the watching had added up to anything worth burdening me with yet. She died in March of 2021, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in November and gone by March, 4 months, which people call fast when they mean there wasn't enough time to do the things you tell yourself you'll get around to eventually. She was 63. The house, which had been ours in the way a house belongs to 2 people who spent 3 decades arguing about paint colors and agreeing about nearly everything else, became mine in the way things become yours, when the other person is gone, which is completely and not at all in the same instant. I have not touched her side of the closet. I still keep the thermostat where she liked it, 2 degrees warmer than I'd set it myself. I have followed her garden journal every spring since, planting what she wrote down for that particular week, in that particular bed, because she was right about growing things the same way she was right about people, and I saw no reason to start disagreeing with her after she couldn't argue back. I had 2 children. My daughter Renee was 41, lived over in Omaha where she worked as a pharmacist, called me every Sunday night without fail, and drove out to the house 1 weekend a month whether I asked her to or not, because that was Renee. She showed up without being told to. She had Donna's way of reading a room, and she'd been telling me since the fall of 2021, careful about it, the way a person breaks bad news slowly to someone they respect, that something about Curtis's situation wasn't sitting right with her. Curtis was 39. He'd spent the better part of 15 years cycling through what he called opportunities, a trucking venture that didn't pencil out, a stint selling agricultural insurance, a partnership in a lawn care outfit that dissolved over money he swore wasn't his fault, and every redirection got described to me as a strategic move rather than what it plainly was, which was the last thing not working out. He wasn't idle. He worked hard at whatever he was doing at the time. He just never stayed anywhere long enough for the hard work to turn into anything that held its shape. He married Marlene in 2015. Marlene was 37, worked as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, and she was sharp and organized in a way I respected the first year of the marriage and grew wary of by the third, because I came to understand that Marlene looked at every situation, including family, including me, as a set of resources to be positioned correctly. She wasn't unkind about it. She was efficient about it. That efficiency was the whole problem, because efficiency doesn't ask whether a thing is yours to reposition. They moved in with me in June of 2021, 3 months after Donna died. Curtis was between opportunities again, and there'd been trouble with their rental in Council Bluffs proper that he described as temporary and complicated, and that I chose not to press on. Because pressing would have gotten me an answer I wasn't ready to carry on top of everything else I was carrying that spring. I offered them the 2 rooms at the east end of the house. It was a generous offer, the kind grief makes you hand out a little too easily. I'd been alone on 11 acres for 3 months, and the quiet had a weight to it that surprised me. And having Curtis and Marlene there, even with everything that came with it, was lighter than that particular weight. At least, at first. That math changed over the next 2 years. Nothing sudden. An accumulation. The way a low spot in a field doesn't look like anything until you've had 3 wet springs in a row and suddenly there's standing water where there never used to be. In August of 2021, 1 month after they moved in, Marlene reorganized my kitchen while I was in Omaha visiting Renee for the weekend. Not dramatic. Practical. She moved the toaster off the counter Donna had kept it on for 19 years because the new spot was closer to the outlet. She switched the drawer where we kept the good silverware with the drawer where we kept the everyday stuff, because she said the good silverware got used more often now that there were 4 of us, and it made sense to have it closer to the table. I put the toaster back the day I got home. Neither of us said a word about it. In October, Marlene mentioned over dinner that the front room furniture wasn't arranged well for how the room actually got used, and that she had some thoughts on it. I told her the room was fine the way it was. She said, "Of course, just an idea." The idea didn't come up again out loud, but it came up in the way ideas that don't get dropped come up, which is in the glances she gave that room every time she walked through it, brief and assessing, the kind of look you give something you haven't given up on yet. In February of 2022, Curtis asked me, careful and casual, how I was thinking about the property long term. Not the house, specifically. The property. Whether it made sense for one man to keep up 11 acres and a 4-bedroom house by himself at my age. He said he'd heard good things about a retirement community over in Bellevue, that a coworker's father had moved there and it had worked out well for everybody. He said he just wanted me thinking ahead. I told him I was exactly where I wanted to be. He said, "Sure, of course, just raising it." I wrote that conversation down in a spiral notebook I'd started keeping in November of 2021, the same month I'd decided that what I was watching in my own house deserved a written record, the same instinct that had made me keep dated job logs for 39 years of excavation work, because a dated record is the one thing nobody can rewrite after the fact to suit themselves. That notebook had 38 pages in it by the time Marlene slid that folder across my kitchen table. The thing that moved me from watching to acting happened on a Saturday afternoon in September, 5 weeks before the folder. I'd driven into town for a part for the tractor and come back earlier than expected because the hardware store had it in stock, and I walked into the house through the mudroom and heard nothing, which should have told me the house was empty, except it wasn't. I found Curtis in my den, at the roll-top desk that had been my father's, sitting in my chair, with the bottom drawer pulled all the way out. That drawer held the deed to the property, Donna's estate paperwork, the farm's old business records, my will, the insurance policies, everything. He had his phone out, angled down at an open folder, and he was photographing pages. He didn't hear me in the doorway. I stood there a moment and watched my own son go through my own private papers with a phone in his hand, and I thought about what a person does with photographs of a property deed and an insurance policy and a will, and there is exactly one category of reason, and none of it is good. Then, I said his name. He looked up and his face went through 3 or 4 things fast before it landed on easy and warm, and he said he'd been looking for the old well permit because he thought the county was asking about it for something. I didn't want to bother me with it. I said I'd handle anything the county needed. I asked him what was in the folder he had open. He said he hadn't really looked, just grabbed the first one. I looked at him for a while. He held that warm, easy face the whole time, the face of a man who has practiced holding it through worse moments than this one. I told him I'd take care of anything involving that desk from here forward, and that he could ask me directly if he ever needed something out of it. He said, "Of course. Sorry. No big deal," and he left the den. I sat in my father's chair for a long time afterward, thinking about photographs of a deed, and about the retirement community in Bellevue Curtis had mentioned back in February, and about Donna, who used to tell her 4th graders that you find out what's true about somebody by watching what they do the moment they think the room is empty, because the performed version and the real version only split apart in the moments nobody's supposed to be watching. I had just watched the real version. I called my attorney the following Tuesday. Gene Alberts, 64 years old, had handled Whitfield Excavating's contracts for 2 decades and Donna's estate after she passed. And the thing I valued in Gene above everything else was that he told me the truth of a situation rather than the comfortable version of it. I drove into his office in Cedar Rapids and sat across from him and laid out 2 years of what I'd watched, not with any heat in it, just the facts in order, dated, the way I'd have delivered a site assessment to a client back when that was my trade. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back and said, "Harold, what outcome are you after here?" I told him I wanted Curtis and Marlene out of my house by the end of the year, done correctly, documented in a way that would hold up if either of them decided to make it difficult. He said under Iowa law, given they'd been living there with no lease and no rent changing hands, they qualified as tenants at will, entitled to 30 days notice at minimum, but he'd recommend 45 days for the paper trail, and he'd recommend sending it certified so there'd be a delivery record nobody could argue with later. I told him to draft it. He asked me once, direct, whether I was sure I didn't want to sit down with Curtis first, man to man, before it came to paper. I told him a conversation with my son about my house was a conversation I'd already been having for 2 years without ever calling it that, and I knew exactly where it ended, and I'd rather have Gene's letter than another year of that same conversation dressed up different ways. He said, "Then we'll do it right." The notice went out certified from his office on a Friday in late September, 45 days written into it, and the delivery slip landed in my mailbox on a Monday, 3 days before Marlene handed me her folder. I'd walked out and collected that slip myself that Monday afternoon, read what it was, and set it back in the mailbox unclaimed, because an unclaimed certified slip just sits there waiting, patient as anything, for whoever's meant to go get it. She came back into the kitchen that Thursday holding the envelope, and her face went through four things before it settled anywhere: confusion first, then something closer to disbelief, and finally a stillness I hadn't seen on her before, the stillness of somebody trying to figure out what move is even left to make. She set it on the table next to her folder. She said, "Harold, what is this?" I said, "It's a notice to vacate. You and Curtis have 45 days to be off this property." She said I couldn't do that. Then she stopped herself and read it again, slower, and Jean's language is clean in the particular way of a man who's written 400 of these and knows exactly how to leave no gap in it for anybody to argue through. She said Curtis didn't know about this. I said he'd know as soon as she told him. She said, "This is because of the folder, isn't it?" I said, "Marlene, I've been watching what's gone on in this house for 2 years. I started writing it down in November of 2021. I called my lawyer in September, 5 weeks ago, the week after I found Curtis going through my desk. That letter left his office over a week ago. You handed me a folder tonight, but the folder isn't why that letter exists. The folder is only why I sent you down the driveway tonight instead of some other night." She sat down slow and set her folder next to the notice and looked at both of them side by side on the table like she was trying to work out which one was actually in charge of the situation, and the expression that came over her then was one I hadn't seen on Marlene in 8 years, which was a woman who had run into a problem that couldn't be managed, because managing was the only gear Marlene had, and Jean's letter didn't have a lever on it anywhere for her to push. She asked what happened if they weren't out in 45 days. I told her Jean would file with the county and the sheriff's department would handle it from there, that it was all public record and I'd rather not go that route, but I would if it came to it, and I wanted her to hear clearly that I would. She picked the letter up, set it down, picked the folder up, set it down. Then she stood and went upstairs, and I heard her voice through the floor on the phone, low and fast. And I sat at my own kitchen table and drank cold coffee and looked at the kitchen, the way Donna had left it. The cabinet doors she'd had me rehang in 2016 so they'd swing the right direction. Finally right, her words. And I thought about the toaster. Marlene moved and I moved back. And about Curtis with his phone out over my father's desk. And about Donna telling her students the room reveals itself when nobody thinks it's being watched. I'd watched that room for 2 years, patient the whole time, gathering what needed gathering before I drew any conclusion, same as I'd have done with a piece of ground before I ever put a blade in it. And now, the letter, sitting on the table, was the conclusion, acted on. Curtis got home at 5:45. I was out at the machine shed, oiling the chain on the tractor because that was the kind of task that let my hands do something while the rest of me sorted through what evening had left. I heard his truck in the drive, heard the kitchen door, and heard the particular hush of a house where a conversation had already been happening and cut off hard the second his boots hit the floor. He came out to the shed at 6:03. I know because I checked my watch. The old habit from 39 years of logging start and stop times on a job, because the timestamp is the thing that matters later, if anybody ever tries to argue the sequence. He stood in the doorway with the notice in his hand, which meant Marlene had it ready and waiting the second she heard his truck. He said, "Dad." I set the oil can down and turned around and looked at my son, standing there holding Jean's letter, wearing the face of a man who'd walked into a conversation he wasn't ready for and was deciding, right there in real time, what version of himself he was going to bring to it. He asked if I'd really gone to a lawyer. I told him 5 weeks ago. He said I hadn't said a word to him about it. I said I hadn't had a reason to say anything until his wife handed me a folder tonight. He said, "So the folder set this off." I said the folder gave me the timing, not the reason. The reason went back to September. He asked what happened in September. I said, "You were in my den on a Saturday with my father's desk drawer open and your phone out, photographing my deed and my will. I walked in from the hardware store and caught you at it." His face changed then, in the way that confirmed something I'd already been sure of but hadn't had proof of until that second, which was that the Saturday in September wasn't an accident, it was deliberate, and what I'd caught wasn't a man embarrassed at being caught somewhere he shouldn't be. It was a man performing embarrassment, and the performance had worked well enough in the moment but wasn't holding up now, standing in a machine shed with a legal notice in his hand. He didn't say anything for a while. The shed smelled like oil and cut grass, and the last of the September evening was doing what it does out here. The light going long and gold across the 11 acres my own father cleared with a mule team, the fence line Donna used to walk every evening after supper, rain or shine, for 31 years. Curtis finally said we couldn't be out in 45 days. I said, "You can. You've both got income." Two working adults can find a place to live in 45 days. That's a solvable problem. What isn't solvable is you staying in this house. I want you to hear that as a decision, not as anger, because it isn't anger. He asked. Why not? It was the most honest question he'd asked me all evening. I said, because anger would mean I was surprised. And I wasn't. I've been watching this since November of 2021. I've got 38 pages of dated notes in a notebook in my den, in the same desk you went through. I called Jean in September because what I'd been watching had gone on long enough that watching it wasn't the right response anymore. None of that is anger. It's just what came next. He said. I'd been keeping notes. I told him 38 pages, dated, starting the November after his mother died. He sat down on the tailgate of my truck, still holding the letter with both hands, the way people hold paper when they're not ready to let go of it, and not ready to act on it either. He said, Mom would have talked to me first. I said, your mother would have caught this before I did. She had 4 pages in her garden journal about the two of you from the spring before she got sick, and she never showed me a one of them, because she was still watching too, and she died before she finished deciding what she'd seen. I got there slower than she would have, but I got there. He looked out past the shed at the fence line, at the last of the light on the soybean stubble in the back 40, and he said, she used to walk that fence every night. I said, every night for 31 years. I still walk it myself, most evenings, following her habit same as I follow her garden book every spring. He sat on that tailgate a good while longer, and I let him sit because there wasn't anything left to say that saying twice would improve. Then he stood up and walked back to the house. They were gone in 39 days, not 45. I know because I counted from the date on Jean's letter, and Jean had told me to keep the count myself in case it ever got disputed later, which it didn't. They took what belonged to them and left what belonged to me, including the toaster, which had wandered back to its original outlet sometime in that last week, and which I noticed and said nothing about. Renee drove out from Omaha the Saturday after they left, arrived Friday night with 2 bags of groceries and a kind of loose, easy relief in her that stayed with her the whole weekend. The relief of somebody who'd been watching a slow problem from a distance for 2 years and had just watched it finally resolve. She walked through the kitchen Saturday morning and stood a minute looking at the cabinets. Donna had had me rehang in 2016, and she said, it looks like Mom's kitchen again. I said, it was always Mom's kitchen. They just moved some things around in it for a while. She asked if I'd moved the things back myself. I told her I had. We walked the fence line together that afternoon, the way Donna used to walk it alone, and Renee asked, partway down toward the pond, whether I'd known that morning, the morning with the folder. I said I'd known the night before, when the delivery slip first showed up in the mailbox that Monday, and I'd read it and set it back down, waiting for the right evening to send somebody down to collect it. Renee said, so you were waiting for her to hand you a reason. I said I was waiting for her to hand me the timing, that the reason had been sitting there for months already, and that Marlene was always going to hand me something eventually, because handing people things dressed up as reasonable was just who Marlene was. Renee laughed the way her mother used to laugh, quick and low, and she said, Dad, that is the most you thing that has ever happened in this family. I told her, Donna would have done it faster. She said Mom would have done it back in 2021. I said, I know I'm slower than she was on the people side of things, but I got there. This house on 11 acres outside Council Bluffs is mine. It was my father's before it was mine, and it will be mine for however many years I've got left in me. And when those years are done, it goes to Renee and Curtis together. Equal shares, written up clean with Jean this past spring. No room in it for anybody to argue later. The deed's back in my father's desk where it belongs. The drawer nobody will ever go through again without asking me first. Donna's garden journals are on the shelf in order by year, and I follow the current one every spring the same as always. The fence line gets walked most evenings, same as it did for 31 years before I ever walked it myself. The kitchen is Donna's kitchen again, cabinets swinging the direction she wanted, toaster on its own outlet. That's what this house is. That's what I built out of it and kept out of it, and, when it needed protecting, protected not loud, not with any shouting in it anywhere, just a certified letter, a plain sentence at a kitchen table, and a mailbox that already had its answer waiting long before anybody thought to hand me a folder.